I was born a Jewish infant in Budapest, Hungary in January 1944. 2 months later, the German army occupies, the Wehrmacht occupies Budapest, deports 500,000 people to their deaths in Auschwitz, my maternal grandparents being amongst them. That experience sets your brain in a certain way, because it is all about trauma. So addiction is manifested in any behavior that a person craves, finds temporary pleasure or relief in, but then experiences negative consequences in the long term and doesn't give up. So I'm going to ask you now, by that definition, Brian, have you ever had an addictive behavior in your life?
Yes, many. In my opinion, I was probably a functional alcoholic. I drank every day. It gave me temporary relief. From the pain I was feeling, usually related to interacting with my fellow humans.
As a spiritual teacher said, addictions all begin in pain and they end in pain. So why do people use? Why do people engage in addictions? Because they have deep emotional problems they don't have the means to resolve on their own. Most chronic illnesses also originate in trauma, including autoimmune disease and cancer and degenerative nervous system disorders and so on, because of the unshakable unity of mind and body. Eckhart Tolle, who was a spiritual teacher, he said that the greatest achievement of humankind is not its architecture or art or scientific glories, but our ability to see our own insanity. That's where the healing is. By the way, healing comes from the Anglo-Saxon word for wholeness. So I have a totally optimistic message, really. I think healing is entirely possible. So if we're going to heal, if we're going to become whole, let's look at everything.
This week on the show, we have Dr. Gabor Maté, who is a specialist on the treatment of addiction. He spent 12 years in downtown Vancouver dealing with the most hardcore drug addicts, HIV sufferers, people that were basically at the end of their lives. And he learned one thing: all drug addiction comes from childhood trauma. Yes, I said it, and that's what he believes. He also believes that many diseases, including some cancers, multiple sclerosis, can be traced back to trauma as well. These are bold statements, and he believes we treat our addicts poorly, like people with mental problems, like lesser citizens, when in fact it's because of their trauma. And on top of that, he argues we all have addictions, shopping addictions, success addictions, broadcasting addictions that are societally okay, and yet we treat them differently than a drug addiction. Dr. Maté is at the cutting edge. I believe he's talking about things that 100 years from now, we will know that are true, but that right now seem a little bit controversial. And that's why I'm really happy to have him on the show. He was born in Hungary right before Nazi Germany invaded. He knows about trauma from being a very young man. He's now 73, and he is still searching for his inner demons. He has some ayahuasca ceremonies planned in Peru for this year. He's a fascinating man, and I think you're really going to enjoy him. I really enjoyed my time with him. I've been waiting to talk to him for the last 2 years. If you would like to download the success secrets from this episode, you can go to londonreal.tv or click on the link in the description and get those for free, so please check that out. And there's all sorts of other amazing things happening on the Academy. If you want to create your very own London Reel, our Broadcast Yourself course is coming very soon. So definitely keep an eye out for that. I'm going to teach you exactly how to create your podcast, how to invite amazing guests like Dr. Maté, how to publish, and how to have it really change your life like it changed my life. And don't forget to follow me on Instagram. I've got stories behind the scenes on Twitter, on Facebook, and all of our social media. And now I leave you with the extraordinary, one-of-a-kind, Dr. Gabor Maté. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Dr. Gabor Maté, the renowned speaker and best-selling author who specializes in neurology, psychology, and psychiatry, as well as the study and treatment of addiction. You were featured in the movie The Culture High by our friend Adam Scorgi, and your 4 best-selling books explore the topics of attention deficit disorder, stress, developmental psychology, and addiction. You spent 12 years in downtown Vancouver in clinics treating patients challenged by hardcore drug use, mental illness, and HIV, and you've used the plant medicine ayahuasca for addiction treatment. Dr. Maté, welcome to London Real.
Pleasure to be here.
Pleasure having you here. I think we've been trying to get you here for years, so it's great to have you in London. So much to talk about. I figured I might just jump in on that last part because you were really in the trenches in downtown Vancouver, and you saw what I think most people don't see. I think we see the Hollywood version of what addiction looks like, or we see what we'd like to think it is, but you saw what it really is. And I was wondering if you could tell us what you saw and what you learned in that period and what you can tell us about it.
The downtown east side of Vancouver, British Columbia is one of the world's ground zeros for addiction, in that in a few square block radius we have thousands of people inhaling and ingesting drugs of all kinds and paying dearly for it. These people are often outside the law, certainly beset by many medical problems due to injection drug use, including psychosis, including HIV, including hepatitis C, cancers. They die of overdoses. And there's also some very innovative services in the downtown east side of Vancouver. So it's really trench warfare, if you like. If there's such a thing as a war on drugs, which is another subject, this is trench warfare. And the people that are the frontline soldiers dying from it are the people affected by addiction. So that's where I worked for 12 years.
Okay.
And what I learned could be summed up really very briefly by saying that addiction is not a choice that anybody makes, it's not a moral failure, it's not an ethical lapse, it's not a weakness of character, it's not a failure of will, which is how our society depicts addiction, nor is it an inherited brain disease, which is how the medical tendency is to see it. What it actually is, it's a response to human suffering. And all these people that I worked with had been severely traumatized as children. All the women had been sexually abused, all the men had been traumatized, some of them sexually, physically, emotionally neglected. And not only is that my perspective, it's also what the scientific and research literature shows. So addiction then is actually, rather than being a disease as such or a human choice, it actually is, it's an attempt to escape suffering temporarily. That's what I learned.
How long did it take you before you figured that out?
Well, by the time I went to work there, I had already been in family practice for 20 years. I'd seen a lot, and I was quite attuned to the impact of early childhood experiences on adult psychology and adult brain physiology. But I just hadn't seen the depth and the degree until I went to work down there. So really it dramatized and confirmed for me, made it very palpable how addictions are a response to suffering, and that what people need in response to addiction is not judgment and not simply symptom control. They need to be helped to heal from their trauma, because it is all about trauma.
And what makes you, at age 60 plus, walk away from a family practice and go down into the trenches? I mean, I've heard stories, but you're really down there where it's, heavy, hardcore drug use, and you're dealing with a lot of emotional trauma as well.
Well, so it's not as romantic as all that. First of all, I do have ADD myself, which means that people with ADD, they want to move on, they do other things. Like you do one thing for a while, then you want to just get on and move into a different area. So that's one general tendency that I do have. And even within family practice, I would always choose different areas to get interested in: child development, palliative care, and so on. Number one. Number two, one goes into medicine at least partially inspired to ease the suffering of humanity. And in Canada, there's no greater realm of suffering than what I, in my book on the subject of addiction, in the realm of hungry ghosts, there's no greater realm of suffering than the realm of hungry ghosts, which is that of addiction, where people are forever trying to fill this emptiness inside. So if one is interested in alleviating suffering, it's a natural area to gravitate to. And then the work is very interesting. It's just interesting work. And you meet interesting people. These are sensitive, interesting people whose tragedy is that their sensitivity was trampled on by the world. And then there's the personal angle that really, it doesn't matter how hopelessly hooked on heroin a client of mine was, and I never was a substance addict, but I could certainly see myself in all of my clients. I have the same hungriness, the same hunger. I can be beset by the same emptiness, same desperation, same desire to fill myself from the outside. I just had more respectable ways of doing it.
A respectable addiction.
Respectable addictions, yeah. So, in other words, I saw the resonance between myself and my clients. So that made it very comfortable for me to work with them.
Can you walk me through what like a typical day was, or a bad day down there? I mean, when you walk in, what are the types of people you see, or the things they're doing, and what might I be surprised? Because in most people's mind, it's that, bad Hollywood movie. It's that TV show that showed that thing. And I'm found from my experiences that most of those are completely wrong for what these people look like or what these situations look like.
The media, the television, cultural depiction of addicts is usually as desperate people, but without showing why they're desperate. So all that shows is the desperation for the drugs. There's no indication of what's driving that desperation. And hence you see them behaving in all kinds of dysfunctional ways. Aggressive or manipulative or unpleasant. But again, there's no three-dimensional sense of the reality of these people as to what that's really all about for them. Now, when you ask about a bad day is like happened in Vancouver maybe 6 weeks ago, when something like close to a dozen people died within a day or two of overdoses. That's a really bad day. And we could talk about how it's not a question of the drugs themselves being responsible for the overdoses, but actually social policy that creates the overdoses. But that maybe is part of a broader conversation. But a bad day, people die. A bad day, people come in with severe illnesses, bone infections, or infections of their heart valves, or their brains, because of their injection drug use. So a bad day is simply when you see a lot of suffering, but that's pretty much par for the course when you work in that area. And so, paradoxically, if you think that's bad, don't work there, because you're going to get burned out very, very quickly. If you're going to put yourself in that area to work with people, you just have to accept that this is what happens, and your job is to help alleviate and, if possibly, prevent suffering.
Is it possible to cure these people, whatever that means, or get them to stop using drugs, or prevent, alleviate?
Wrong question. When you say, is it possible to cure people, you're speaking from the Western model, where I am the expert, and you're the one with the disease, and I'm going to cure you, like you cure a piece of meat, No. The answer to that question, framed that way, is no, it's not possible. If you're asking, is it possible for people to heal from trauma sufficiently that they don't have to keep escaping into addictions to lessen the suffering of their trauma? Yes, that's entirely possible. But the question is, under what conditions is that possible? And under the conditions that obtain in London, UK, or Vancouver, British Columbia, or in New York, or any place, under the conditions that obtain socially, legally, and from the perspective of medical practice, it's hardly a likelihood, because we're approaching it from the wrong direction and with the wrong perspective.
I think you once said that if you were able to, I won't say the word cure again, but prevent them from relapsing to addiction again, even 5% of your patients, you would be lauded as, an incredible genius, as in that would be amazing.
Yeah, if I could constantly demonstrate that with this particular population, I could affect a 5 or 10% success rate of getting people to leave their addictions behind, I'd be considered to be a genius, because our results are so poor. When I say ours, I don't mean ours specifically in Vancouver. I don't mean that. I mean the overall treatment model for addiction is so poor in succeeding with the most affected segments of the population.
Right.
So, I mean, addictions are like everything else on a spectrum. So a lot of people do heal from addictions, but the most inveterate, most entrenched addicts, they have the hardest time. And they're also the ones whom society gives the hardest time, so that it makes it even harder to help them.
Right. So they're the ones that are vilified more because of their intensity and their behavior,
Yeah.
and then they don't get the help they need.
Well, never mind they don't get the help they need, they actually get actively punished. And so what you've actually got is traumatized children. When children are traumatized, that affects how they feel about themselves, which is deeply ashamed, because a child always believes that it's about himself. So if I'm being hurt like this, I gotta be a terrible person. Or if I was sexually abused, why didn't I fight back? I must be a very weak person. So there's a deep sense of shame. Then there's tremendous emotional pain that accrues from abuse and neglect. Tremendous emotional pain that is hardly possible for people to bear. Now they have to soothe their pain with substances or other compulsive behaviors. Then the trauma itself, given that the human brain develops an interaction with the environment, shapes the brain circuitry in such a way that the person will be more likely to find relief from the drugs. So the very physiology of the brain is affected by early trauma. So then you take these traumatized people and you make their habit illegal. It's not illegal to drink yourself to death. It's not illegal to make yourself sick with emphysema or lung cancer by means of cigarettes, but it's illegal to use other substances. So now you take these abused, traumatized people, you place them outside the law, you put them in jails, and you hound them all their lives, treating them like criminals and bad people and failures and rejects and less than human. And then we wonder how come they don't get better. So it's a self-perpetuating cycle of taking traumatized people and then re-traumatizing them, and then hoping at the same time, why don't they listen? Why don't they get better already? Why don't they give it up? Well, they don't give it up because the more hurt they are, the more they need to escape.
You once said that in order to understand some of these people, look at the reason they took the drugs in the first place. And that's kind of the key.
Yeah.
And what are some of those reasons?
Well, I mean, can I ask you a personal question?
Of course.
Yeah, so I'll define addiction for you, okay? A standard, non-controversial definition. So addiction is manifested in any behavior that a person craves, finds temporary pleasure or relief in, but then experiences negative consequences in the long term and doesn't give up. So craving relief, pleasure short term, long-term negative consequence, inability to give it up. That's what addiction is. I said any behavior. I didn't say drugs. Could be drugs. So I'm going to ask you now, by that definition, Brian, have you ever had an addictive behavior in your life?
Yes, many.
Okay, so I'm not going to ask you what, when, or for how long. I'm just going to ask you, what did you like about it? What did it do for you?
It gave me temporary relief.
From?
From the pain I was feeling, usually related to interacting with my fellow humans.
Okay.
Or how I felt doing that.
Okay, so you had the emotional pain that was triggered for you by interaction with people.
And maybe even with being myself as well.
How you experience yourself.
I think I wanted to get away from myself.
You weren't comfortable in your own skin.
I think so, yeah.
Okay, fair enough. In other words, the addiction provided pain relief for you, temporarily.
Yes.
Now, as a spiritual teacher said, addictions all begin in pain and they end in pain. But we're talking about the beginnings now. In other words, the addiction wasn't your problem. Your problem was that you had a lot of emotional pain, you didn't know what to do with. So the addiction was really an attempt to solve a problem. So when you say, why do people use substances, or why do they engage in addictions in general, it's because they have a problem they don't know what to do with. And if you really understand their addiction, like with yourself, you have to ask, well, what gave you so much emotional pain? And how come you didn't have the internal resources? This is not a judgment, it's simply an inquiry. How come you lacked at some point the internal resources to deal with that pain in a more creative, forward-looking way that would help you resolve the pain rather than to perpetuate it? So really what it was is that the addiction came along to help you solve a problem you had no other solutions for at the time. And that's the case for all addictions. So why do people use? Why do people engage in addictions? Because they have deep emotional problems they don't have the means to resolve on their own. That's why they use.
Okay. And nobody could, then how come someone couldn't help me figure this out?
Well, that's why I write my books.
Okay.
Because I tell you why. Because I'm here in London speaking at a conference on trauma. And the average medical student, I don't know how many doctors you saw, but the average medical student, until very recently, has never even heard the word trauma in their education. It doesn't show up. We don't talk about it. We don't talk about its impact on the brain, on the personality, on the emotional life of people, on its impact on people's physical health. It's not a word that we mention. We're traumaphobic. As a fellow doctor said to me, the medical profession is traumaphobic. So
they leave that to the psychiatrists or psychologists.
My God, the psychiatrists are the last people they leave it to.
Okay.
That's a whole other subject. Because psychiatrists these days are trained mostly in this biological model of psychiatry where everything comes down to a biological brain disease. Here, let's give you a pill. The last thing most psychiatrists know how to talk about is actually emotional pain or its origins in human experience. They just, you think they know how to do that, but they don't. They're not trained in it. It's not part of the predominant medical ideology. And you know, as a physician, I can tell you, we like to think of medical as a science, and it has certainly great scientific achievements to its credit and great scientific insights to buttress its successes. But it's as much as ideology as science. And ideology has certain hidden assumptions that are hidden from the people that believe in ideology. And so that if something is excluded by your ideology, you just won't see it. And so that you can be talking to somebody about your addiction, and the simple question, what did they do for you? And how come you're in so much emotional pain? Doesn't occur to anybody, you know, trained in a classical manner. No, this is true not just for physicians, it's true for a lot of psychologists as well, who are more interested in solving your problems and getting you to overcome the behavior than in asking, well, okay, where does this behavior come from? And what are you still carrying inside that's making you behave that way? And how can we help you resolve what's inside you? Not just how do we help you change your behavior, but how do we help you change? Now that's what healing is. And that happens inside a person. So it's never a question of anybody curing anybody else, but we can guide people to healing if we ask the right questions.
Okay. And sometimes give them the right treatments can help them guide them.
Yes, and there's a whole range now of not panaceas, because there's no one treatment that works for everybody, but once we understand the origins of something in trauma, then there's a whole panoply of treatments that can work for different sets of people.
Okay.
But first you have to recognize the problem.
So let me go a little deeper on what I was thinking about when it came to my addictions.
Sure.
So from basically the age of 18 to 38, in my opinion, I was probably a functional alcoholic. I drank every day.
Okay.
And again, now that I look back at it, I've had a little wisdom doing London Real the last few years, and I'll tell you a little more why. I think I was getting away from me, who I think was driving me to be the ultimate best at what he does, and I'll get to that shortly. I'm very smart. I know that this was a stupid behavior. It was a temporary fix that I usually paid for dearly the next day. and repeatedly paid for. And yet, because of my resolve or whatever, I managed to, eke out what most people would call a successful life. And the more I did it, the more I think my self-esteem dropped a little bit, because I couldn't control this about myself, whereas I could find success, whatever that means, in other aspects of my life. And so it wasn't until I started doing this show, and I had a first ayahuasca ceremony, that I was like, okay, now I'm going into a realm I'm not familiar with. It was scary, but part of me knew there was something there. And I had my second ayahuasca ceremony, and while we're being so honest, I was pretty much right here at the time on a sofa. And I distinctly remember laying down on this sofa after I had the plant medicine, and I was crying so much that the tears were going down my eyes and dripping down off my ears. And I still remember the tears dripping off my ears. And I was going back, I was visualizing a 7-year-old boy. And this was me when my parents divorced.
Yeah.
And this was this little boy that was building up all these walls around him because he had been hurt so much. And so for me, it was like, no one's getting in the rest of my life. And maybe, based on what I've read about your stuff, my attempting to excel in the world was to show the world that they needed me, so maybe that's why I went to MIT and got the job in banking, these kinds of things. And so seeing that in that ceremony just showed me how I would just shut off from the world. And I think that brought on more pain and more judgment on myself. And so from then on, I kind of tried to make sure that I kind of opened my heart up to a lot of these things, and also to try to reconnect to this world that I couldn't connect to earlier. So that was kind of my story.
Well, it's an archetypical story.
Yeah.
So first of all, you're hurt as a child, and then you have to compensate for it. So you compensate in two ways. One is by becoming a success, and like I said about myself, when you get the message when you're a young child that the world doesn't want you and need you, then one great way to deal with it is to go to medical school, because now they're going to need you all the time.
Right.
And the more they need you, the more positive feedback you get, the more you get sucked into it.
Right.
But as for your success, quote unquote, and mine success, quote unquote, there's a subtext, which is a real niggling, not even spoken, but definite fear inside. Do they really want me? Or is it what I'm doing for them that they want? So this is where the hunger comes from. You can never get enough. Because by doing, you're never satisfied when your hunger is about being and not having been accepted just for being. No, that's one way to compensate. When despite all your best efforts and your successes and your ability to impress people, the gnawing pain still shows up, now you use something to soothe the pain. And what do you say about somebody who drinks too much, by the way? There's an old expression.
It's someone just like you. No, it's someone you don't like who drinks as much as you.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, fair enough. No, but it's more specific. When somebody's drunk too much, there used to be an old saying, they're feeling no pain.
Okay.
They're feeling no pain. Well, that's exactly what it's about.
Right.
Now, look, in terms of what you said about escaping from yourself, Keith Richards, who, as you know, had a ferocious heroin habit for a while, in his book, Life, his autobiography, he says, I'm paraphrasing, but it's very close. He says, the contortions we go through just not to be ourselves for a few hours. And that discomfort with the self originates back to being a 7-year-old, and even younger than 7, because the divorce happened when you were 7, but your parents were miserable and unhappy with each other for years before then. Otherwise, they wouldn't have got divorced. And guess what that misery was all about in your mind? It's all about you.
Me, yeah.
Because children interpret the world in those narcissistic ways, that whatever happens is because of me. So you failed to make your parents happy. And of course you're uncomfortable with yourself. Not to mention, the more sensitive a child is, the more he or she absorbs the stresses and tensions and upsets of their parents. That's a lot to deal with. And it's a lot to deal with, especially when there's nobody there to talk to about it, who can actually listen to how you feel and validate your emotions gives you some support, then you just develop this idea that I got to do it all myself. I'm on my own. And this drives a lot of people, a lot of successful people in our society. That's what they're driven by. So that by the standards of a materialistic world, success looks a certain way. But look at the internal life of those people. You know, they think the world is a horrible place. I'm quoting Donald Trump. He said the world is a horrible place. That's the world he lives in. He lives in a world that's a horrible place. How would you like to live in a world that's a horrible place? Doesn't matter how many billions you have. Doesn't matter what powers you've accrued. How would you like to live in a world that's a horrible place? No. Why does he see it that way? Because he was a traumatized kid. His father was a rageaholic, demanding, demeaning, emotionally abusive person. His brother drank himself to death. Trump is a huge success who lives in a horrible world.
When you look at the lives of successful people, the billionaires, the CEOs,
Yeah.
do you see the very same pattern recognition as the addicts you treat in downtown Vancouver?
Very often, when I've studied the lives of some of them in depth, very often, I don't want to generalize, but a lot of people I've looked at have been that way. And well, the only thing that's different is their addiction is played out in, like mine was, and maybe yours was. I'm not talking about the drinking, but I'm talking about the success, and you know, in a financial world that you may have had, the successes represent addictive drives whose negative impact on the world is tremendous. You know, who creates more suffering? Somebody who sells an ounce of heroin to somebody else to feed their own habit, or somebody who destroys the Amazon forest for some financial gain. Which addict causes the more problems in the world? So it's very economically, socioeconomically defined as to what success is and who's the addict and who we need to really look at.
Talk to me about what you think about, say, North America's relationship with drugs. Does it go back to some Puritan sense where we don't want to allow ourselves pleasure to some extent? Is that where a lot of this whole battle in the mind that then becomes manifested as a war against drugs, et cetera, whereas other cultures maybe are more allowing of that, maybe they're more open to that? How do you view it? Because it doesn't seem to make sense.
Well, when you say North America, I don't see much difference throughout the Western world, actually.
Okay.
It's fairly universal, the so-called war on drugs. And again, my mantra about that is there's no war on drugs because you can't make war on inanimate objects. There's a war on drug addicts. In other words, we're warring on the most traumatized segments of the population. And that's true as much here in Britain as it is in France or United States. Although the United States, of course, leads the world. So as we know, the world's population, 4 or 5% of the world's population are Americans, 25% of the world's jail population are Americans. So every 5th person in the world in jail is a citizen of the land of the free. And there is reasons for that. But pleasure seeking is hardly it, because there's no more hedonistic society than the United States. I mean, the desperation to experience pleasure, the pursuit of happiness, as if happiness was something external to you that you could pursue. I mean, that's an interesting phrase right there. Yeah. The pursuit of happiness. But
maybe that sets the landscape from the beginning.
Of course.
I mean, the Buddha wouldn't say that.
No, he wouldn't say that at all.
Okay.
But pleasure seeking and the rejection of pleasure seeking, it may play some role in certain people's attitude, but it's not what drives it overall. Actually, if you look at it historically, it's has very much a racial tinge to it in the United States. Minority peoples are much more likely to be arrested and charged with and convicted of drug charges than other people. For the possession of the same chemical, a black person will get 10 times the jail sentence that a white person will, for example, cocaine.
Yeah.
Depending on which form.
Yeah.
You know, there's a wonderful film I saw recently on Netflix called The 13th, which is the 13th Amendment, which is that slavery is outlawed. You can't benefit from people's coerced labor unless they're criminals. That's the 13th Amendment.
Okay.
So after the Civil War, when they could no longer use black slaves, now they created black criminals. And then they could use them in the chain gangs. And it follows that whole miserable history up till recently. And so I think it's very complex in the States, but racial politics has a lot to do with it. So does pharmaceutical control. It's highly medicated society, but we just like the medications to be dispensed by people who can make profits off it. So it's the most medicated society in the history of the world, and certainly in the world today. So that there's many reasons, but the deepest reason, I think, is the denial of pain. We're a society that denies the pain that this society causes.
Right.
So on the one hand, we engender pain. Look, I was writing the not YouTube, sorry, that's an interesting phrase. I was reading the Tube in London today.
Yeah.
Not the YouTube. And reading the Metro. It's locally published.
Free paper, yeah.
Free paper. On the second page, 2 items, right next to each other. The one is that there's a new British study that says that something like 65% of Britons had suffered some kind of emotional crisis or problem in their lifetime, some kind of mental health issue, panic attacks, depression, something. A new survey by one organization or another. So next to those details is a little news item about the Queen, who's telling her family not to talk so much about their mental health problems, and that their job should be to open ceremonial events, you know, cut the ribbons at museums and bridges and throw champagne bottles at ships, I suppose, but let's not talk about mental health issues in the royal family, because apparently the grandchildren, is it Prince Henry, recently talked about his depression and anxiety that arose from what? The traumatic childhood that he had.
Right.
Why did he have a traumatic childhood? Because his mother died when he was very young. Because his father and mother both had extramarital affairs. Because they grew up in a terribly stressed household. Of course they're traumatized. And so he does this fairly brave thing to talk about it. And grandma comes along and says, just open museums. Don't open your heart. So that I'm saying that we're living in a society that denies pain. Stiff upper lip and all that.
Right. Which just perpetuates the problem.
Which exacerbates it.
Right.
Yeah.
And when you look at the way we treat our drug addicts, it's by the way we run our society. And so it's, you know, these people economically, they're in an economic prison, is the way you're talking about, the 13th Amendment. And yet we wonder why later they become addicts. And then we still don't know what to do with them and treat them poorly, and this cycle continues.
Well, in Canada, as in other former British colonies, which population suffers most from addiction is the Aboriginal population. So in Vancouver, downtown east side, 30% of my clients were First Nations, Aboriginal, Canadian origins. They make up 5% of the population. Same thing in Australia. Why? Because under colonialism, under the benign wings of the British Empire, the colonials, the Aboriginals, had to be displaced. Their culture had to be literally destroyed, and their self-image had to be transformed into a totally negative one. So they have the most pain. And of course the pain wasn't just induced by the colonial enterprise hundreds of years ago, it was reinforced by policies that reflected that until very, very recently. In fact, maybe even until today. So they're the most hurt segment of the population. Naturally, they're the most addicted segment of the population. So that to deal with that, we'd have to look at ourselves and say, well, what kind of society are we that engenders so much pain in vulnerable people and then punishes them for that desperation to escape from their pain? So those questions that pertain to addictions actually involve the very nature of the society that we live in, and what we value, and what we reward, and what we ostracize. These are hard questions. I'm saying they're genuinely hard questions.
Yeah.
And so it's easier not to look at them.
What comments do you usually get from people when you drop this kind of science on them? You know, because it's a, you know, it points, look at this problem, and it comes right back to you and the way you behave towards all of these people, and we're perpetuating it.
Well, see, I don't hear from too much from the people that disagree with me. I mean, I do every once in a while, but it's kind of self-selected. The people that read, my books are bestsellers in Canada, and my book on addiction is in the top 2 or 3 best-selling books on addiction in the States, according to Amazon anyway. In other words, they have a lot of success. The Canadian Minister of Health is tweeting about the book now, you know, and so that I get a lot of positive feedback. Now, the people that don't agree with me so much, they don't come and hear me talk. Why would they want to? So it's a self-selected audience, I suppose, that reads my books and comes to hear me address these issues. So I don't hear too much negative feedback. What mostly happens with this perspective is that it's not covered in the mainstream media. They don't want to hear about trauma and pain. This is true certainly here in England. It's also true in North America.
Why is that? Don't we love a good trauma story? We love a good terrorist story. How come we don't love a good trauma story?
Because in the terror story, we're the victims. We love being the victims. Now that's an interesting analogy, by the way. So yesterday, my wife and I walked near Parliament buildings, and on that bridge where that so-called terrorist attack happened, I don't think it was a terrorist attack. It was a terrible, terrorizing event, but by my definition of terrorism, which is really an organized group setting it up and all that, it was sounded like some very disaffected, fairly emotionally disturbed person.
That's what it was.
Who bought into a certain kind of ideology and used that as an excuse to vent his hatred on innocents. You know?
Yeah, he probably had a trauma, and maybe he was
I'm sure he was a traumatized person.
Yeah.
You know? So there is such a thing as terrorism, but I don't think that was it. But we like to talk about that because then we get to be victims and we get to be self-righteous. Now, what we don't have to look at, I mean, I was in a bookstore today. I bought a book on Charles Darwin. It looks really interesting. But there was a book by an Indian writer from India, and I forget the title now. But I'm rambling a bit. But if you indulge me for a moment,
yeah.
Yesterday I was walking in Trafalgar Square, and there was a statue of, and I forget which British general.
Nelson, the big tall one.
No, I don't mean Nelson.
Oh, okay.
No, I don't mean Nelson. I mean one of the ones who was viceroy in India.
Okay.
And he led the British forces against the Sepoy rebellion, one of these attempts by the Indians to rise up against their oppressors, against their colonial masters, and glorified for massacring Indians who just wanted to be free in their own country. I'm talking about from India. So, and I was thinking to my wife, I just wonder how the average Indian tourist to Britain feels about that statue. So today I'm in a bookstore, and there's a book by an Indian writer about Inglorious Empire, maybe the title, I forget, what the British did to India. Now, I'm talking about terrorism, broadly speaking. If you look at the areas of the world where the terrorism emanates from, how many hundreds of thousands of them have been killed by Western bombs? Going back to the 1910s, and the 8 million Congolese that were killed by the Belgians. Do we even know about it? The tens of thousands, and by now hundreds of thousands of Arabs who've been killed by Western arms in their own countries. In other words, I'm not saying that therefore we justify terrorism or we don't protect against it. But I am saying, are we really interested in understanding the source of it? Or do we just want to be victims? And how would our response be different if we actually went to the trouble of informing ourselves of what creates people like that and what has been our role in creating people like that?
Continue watching this fascinating conversation for free by clicking on the link below to visit our website, and I'll see you on the inside.
People kept asking me, well, what do you know about ayahuasca in particular and the treatment of addiction? And I knew nothing. Somebody came up to me and said, you know what, you could actually participate in the ceremony not far from where you live. So I did. And like you, I don't want to compare experiences, but it was profound and transformative enough for me to see the potential in it right away.